Walter said, Dean Raskin is on his way to Japan right now, and he asked me to come here. What I immediately said, yes, that would be an honor. I'm the new-ish dean, associate dean for research, I think, well, what I was told by Dean Raskin is think about the topic, and you will feel a few things, that you will say a few things about the topic, and indeed, the idea of revolution is quite interesting. I started thinking about that. It came to my mind, certainly, what I recently actually learned about the Detroit, quote-unquote, riots, and how a word can actually make a whole lot of difference on how you interpret what actually happened. Certainly, Russian Revolution comes to mind very often. But there are two revolutions that personally change the way I see things. One of them is the Industrial Revolution, particularly in England, and starting in its late 1700s all the way to the 1840s or so, and how that changed the scenario, how that changed, you had the Luddites really going against that and not willing to have changes because they were threatened by that. You invoke all of these Dickensian ideas of child labor and rampant prostitution, and somehow that led us to modernity. And that's another thing that you think about revolution. It's quite interesting what the outcomes might be, but certainly without that particular revolution, our world would be pretty different today. And another one, and that's important to me because in my non-working time, I spend a lot of time reading history and archaeology, and the Victorian era and all of its implications are quite interesting to me. So that was an obvious correlation to make. And the other one is even more personal. That is the scientific revolution. And when I was an undergrad, I decided, erroneously probably, that I could read and understand Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. And I don't really think that I was even able to understand what I thought I would understand. But it was interesting to come with this idea that from time to time you need to rattle the cage, and you need to shift paradigms, and you need to use a kind of a buzzword that we use all the time today. You need to think outside of the box, right? That had huge implications for me because as a undergrad trying to prove to the world that I could understand chemistry, I realized that it wasn't wrong or it wasn't a bad idea. It was actually a very good idea to have an open mind and to enjoy, literature, history, languages, and that shaped basically the way that I see things, as well as the way that I try to do my own science in the lab, just by saying, well, it is not because this is accepted as correct that we shouldn't change that. And from time to time paradigms shift, and that's why revolutions are very important. And that's why we need to understand revolutions. That's why we need to analyze them. We need to dissect them. We need to understand them until the next paradigm shift when ideas change and we redo all the process again, right? So without further ado, it is certainly my honor to be here and to welcome everybody that came to the Faculty Fellows Conference, and also to say that this conference embodies the values of the Humanities Center in terms of fostering inter, multidisciplinary collaboration among several different areas and enables that to happen. So without further ado, welcome and These are all this.
Hello, everybody. My name is Cindy Krolikowski. I'm the Special Collections Librarian here in the Wayne State University Library System. It's my pleasure today to introduce our first two speakers, who are Krista Brumley, who's an Associate Professor and the Director of Graduate Studies in the Wayne State University Sociology Department, and Shirin Montazer, the Assistant Professor in the Wayne State University Sociology Department. The title of their presentation is 21st Century Technological Revolution and Its Discontents, Work-Family Conflict in Long-Distance Commuter Relationships. Professors?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a Friday. So we'd like to start by thanking Dr. Edwards, the Humanities Center's team, and the advisory board for supporting this research. What Shirin and I are going to present today is just a small piece of a larger mixed methods interdisciplinary team. And so, right on cue, Catherine. I would like to give a shout out to our other team members on this project, and that is Catherine McGuire, who just walked in from communication, Boris Galtez over in psychology as well, and then Jamie Cobb is a graduate student that's been working with us. So what I'm going to do today is just walk through, just set up the how we ended up thinking about the study, why we set it up the way we did, and then Shirin's going to talk about the findings. So we know that workplaces have changed dramatically over the past several decades. They've downsized, they've restructured, they've expanded globally. Many employees change jobs quite frequently now. And what this has done is put larger demands on employees. They tend to work longer hours. They might travel for work, either short-term or long-term assignments. Because many companies are global now, longer hours are demanded of employees, also in part not just to meet whatever the productivity is for the week, but they'll go in at 6 a.m. in the morning, they'll stay, to work late, they've got conference calls they might take from home, and this is stretching out work days for employees. So we know that these demands at work often contribute to work-family conflict. So when we think about work-family conflict, it's two flows. It's where work life interferes with one's family life, as well as family life interferes with one's work life. And so when those two competing demands struggle against each other for time, for energy, for attention, this is where we see conflict. So both forms of work-family conflict have had detrimental consequences on mental health, and there's a recent study that's out that is arguing that work-family conflict is producing more conflict than unemployment, which is something we know creates lots of conflict in families, but also exposure to secondhand smoke. So we have scholars that are making the argument that work-family conflict is the #1 mental health issue in North America today. And so one of the other ways that we can think about work-family conflict and what might exacerbate it is a geographical distance and together time. And so what we know from the research is that if you have geographical separations within couples, that it might be very difficult for them to interact on a daily basis with quality of time. So separation has been assumed to be detrimental because they're not able to have these kinds of interactions and figure out what's happening in the household. Right, so research tells us that commuter marriages, so 3 or more nights away, so think about whether they're married or they're cohabitating couples, they're partners, one of them travels on a regular basis for work, maybe once a month or maybe every other week for a couple days a week, and what that might matter for how they figure out what happens in the household. This can be really stressful. However, other research suggests that long distance relationships, right, so if you're maintaining 2 different households, it might not actually be inherently stressful. It might be a stress reliever. So this is where our team said, all right, let's try to figure out what's going on. I have lots of heads nodding about the stress reliever part. So this was where we started our study and what we wanted to try to figure out. So the purpose of the project was to examine these geographical and temporal constraints. How do they intersect with work-family conflict among dual income partnerships? That's important to know. And right, so is it time, is it distance, is it both? How does it matter? So what Shirin and I are going to talk about today is just a small part of this larger project. What are the effects of geographic separation and together time on emotional health, and how does work-family conflict mediate geographic separation, together time on emotional health? So how we did this. So as I mentioned, we have this interdisciplinary team. Last summer, we developed a survey. We used Qualtrics to launch the survey to recruit our participants. Our sample size is 404, so it was all over the United States. They had to be, so the sample inclusion, we only are focusing on married or cohabitating partners. They had to live in the United States, and they both had to be employed. We did not sample on whether or not they have children. So we have people in the sample that some have children, some do not have children. Final sample size was 404. Because it's mixed methods, I do qualitative research. Shirin, who's going to be presenting the numbers, does quantitative research. Catherine does both. Boris as well. We're also doing qualitative in-depth interviews. So far, 3 of the people who filled out the survey, we've done interviews with them, and now Catherine and myself, we're expanding that sample size to be larger, and we're working on those interviews now. So I will turn it over to Shirin, who's going to talk about those numbers.
I'll go close to this so I can.
Okay, so I'm just going to briefly go over the measures. The first measure of interest is our relationship types. The respondents were asked to self-identify in one of the 4 relationship types that I will briefly describe. Those who indicated no significant time constraints or geographic separation were put in the proximal group. So when I talk about proximal respondents, that's who I'm referring to. The constrained group is composed of those who have significant time constraints but no geographic separation. The commuter group is composed of those that have no significant time constraints, but they have part-time geographic separation. And finally, our long distance group is those that indicate significant constraints on time and full-time geographic separation. Quickly, measures of family to work conflict is based on 5 items that ask the respondent how often, from never to very often, have you not had enough time for your work because of your family or home life? Have you not had the energy to do the things at work because of your home or family life? Has home or family life kept you from doing as good a job at work as you could? And 2 other items that I don't want to spend too much time through. Our work to family conflict is an index composed of 8 items that ask the reverse. So for example, the respondents were asked to indicate whether the following items apply to them: never to very often, and some of them are: I do not have enough time for my family or other important people in my life because of my job. I do not have the energy to do the things with my family or other important people in my life because of my job. And there are a number of others that I can come to if anyone's interested to know the exact measures. We have 2 measures of, I call mental health, but really our main mental health measure is psychological distress, which is based on 33 items adopted from Radolf Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale. And the respondents were asked within the past 2 weeks how often, none of the time to all of the time, did you think that your life had been a failure? Did you feel lonely? Did you feel tense? Did you worry over possible misfortunes? Or appetite was poor? These are just some of the examples. And we measure guilt as well, even though guilt is not really a mental health measure, it's more of an emotional state. And we just asked the respondents to indicate in the past 7 days, on how many days have you felt guilty? And obviously 1 to 7 was the range. We control for a number of variables that I don't want to go into too much detail about, but we control for the basics, gender, whether it's they're married or cohabiting, age, race, education, really how long the respondents have been together, number of kids under the age of 6, household income, and how much they communicate with each other. Then we have measures for the respondents, how many hours they work at work per week, how many hours they work at home, if they have a standard day shift, if they travel for work, and if they do, how many numbers a week are they gone for work. Their job security and their occupation, and for the partners we had measures for hours worked per week, standard day shift, whether they travel for work, and if they do, how many nights is the spouse away. We used ordinary least squares to answer our research questions. And we had quite a few missing in terms of income in particular and occupation, so we used multiple imputation to impute for those. If we didn't, we would have 331 cases and we would lose a lot of respondents. So we imputed the data. Guilt was positively skewed, so it's log transformed. So whenever I refer to guilt, it's a log transformed measure. And over 80% of the sample was female. I guess women are on the internet more responding to these surveys, which unfortunately does not allow us to do interaction analysis for this presentation. And this is kind of small, but briefly, this is our descriptive statistics, and I'm just going to point to a few important ones. I guess you can't see those, but what we see, this is group differences. I looked for group differences among any of the four, and all I've been able to notice with this data is that work-to-family conflict is significantly higher among those who are in constrained and commuting relationships as compared to only the proximals. And family-to-work conflict is only higher, significantly higher among the commuting couple as compared to the proximals. Distress is also higher among the commuting group. And I can come back to this if anyone's interested to see other. But here is our main findings in just like a brief snapshot. So the first two columns show results for guilt, multivariate results for guilt. The first model is the unadjusted model of regressing the three commuter types as compared to the proximals on guilt log transformed. And as you can see, the commuters and the constraints have significantly higher guilt than those in proximal relationships. But once we adjust for all the control variables that I mentioned, only those in constrained relationships continue to experience higher higher guilt than the proximals. Moving on to distress, it's basically the same pattern. The only difference is that in our unadjusted model, the commuters have higher distress than also those in long-distance relationships. But that finding disappears once we adjust. And what we see is that it looks like the distress and guilt is significantly higher among those in constrained relationships. So moving on, we enter the baseline here is the adjusted model for each that I showed. And I've added work-to-family conflict in this model, and as you can see, the effective constraint on guilt disappears. And it also disappears in a third model where family-to-work is included. And both work-to-family conflict and family-to-work conflict have significant impacts on guilt. They both increase guilt. They also both increase distress, and they fully explain their addition to the models, explaining individually on their own the higher distress among the constrained group. So moving just to
wrap it up.
pass it to Krista.
Right. So we know that research shows that work-to-family conflict and family-to-work conflict increases emotional health problems and the psychological health Shirin just talked about, we talked about in terms of just distress and guilt. So in our study, both time and distance did matter, but not together. Long-distance respondents did not have different levels of work-family conflict or emotional problems compared to those proximal relationships. And the proximal relationships, to remind everybody, those were the ones that said that they were able to interact on a daily basis. So they don't have the geographic separation or the together time constraint. So it's suggesting to us that possibly leading separate lives, so if they're in these long distance, the two households might actually be a stress reliever. So there were no significant differences between the commuter, so those that are constrained by distance. So they make the argument that they can spend, that they are able to interact they cannot interact on a regular basis, but they can spend quality time. I always flip them around. The constrained groups are the ones that have the constrained time. So, I'm sorry, so constrained ones interact on a daily basis, but it's not quality time. Commuters is the opposite. So this is suggesting to us there's something particular about this constrained group that we really need to unpack and drill down and figure out what's going on, because they had greater negative impact on guilt and distress. So not being able to spend quality time together seems to be producing distress and guilt. So I am going to talk about one person. I have one quote here that I will talk about from one of the interviews. Her name, we're calling her Kim. She was a healthcare assistant. She works about 4 evenings a week. From the evening shift, she'll go in at 4 o'clock. She comes home around 11 o'clock. Her husband works during the day, so it's usually a 7 to 4 shift or a 7 to 7 shift. So when I asked her about how work impacts their family life, this is what she says. She says, it's the same every day. I'm up between 6 and 6:30. I get the older kids up first, shower, and then the 7-year-old. I get her lunch and on the bus. I fix my hair. By then, the 4-year-old is up. She'll help with the laundry, then I set up dinner. And I leave a note for my oldest on what to do. This is what Sally gets, this is for somebody else. The oldest that she's talking about here is her 13-year-old daughter. So it's actually not the oldest. She has an older son who's 14, gonna be 15 soon. So she's really referring to her 13-year-old daughter. So the meals are plated, she'll give the baths, again, her daughter, when she's not home. I save homework for the nights I don't work. I go to work and get home after 11. Sometimes there are dishes in the sink, so I'll do those. I don't like to leave them overnight. She then goes on in this part of the interview to talk about how her and her husband managed parenting and the issues with having teenage children plus having these younger children. And so she eventually says, there's guilt all the time. Our biggest thing is that we don't have time together, and I know that was the road that we chose when we decided to have children. So Kim, again, is in this constrained group. So some of our next steps, what we want to do is look at what is it about long-distance relationships that seems to not be creating the difference? What is it about this constrained group that seems to be popping on all of our data so far? We need to do more data collection. We need to get a larger sample because maybe it will produce different findings. And preliminary analysis of some of the other things that we haven't presented today do suggest that there are some gender effects. And we'd like to explore that more with a larger N. What's interesting about it, we've most of the research, earlier research talks about work-family conflict impacting women most, but more recent research is actually talking about how it's impacting, so mothers, how it's impacting fathers, and sometimes more, because they're being expected to be involved dads. So not just the breadwinner, they're expected to do things in the house as well. And so then moving forward with our qualitative data collection is where we're at now. When I set up the study, I was talking about that. And then we'll go back and do more quantitative data. Thank you.
We do have 9 minutes left if someone has
Nice
any
try.
questions.
We were really good on time.
We were excellent.
I'm actually quite impressed. I'm a little worried. All right.
So this is really fascinating. I have several questions, so pick and choose. One is all right. So I'm interested in class. That is white collar versus blue collar. Second, I'm interested about how you can tell about the vectors of guilt. So I'm interested that guilt comes between spouses, and I've always thought that guilt comes from quality time with children, rather than, I don't know if you call that vertically versus horizontal guilt, right? The third thing is, it comes from the title of your talk, and that is the idea of technology. And I guess it's kind of outside your study, but I'm interested in kind of how work and home, the separation, that the separation is disintegrating because of email, dealing with job issues through the website that is, and kind of how that would influence your findings.
I will respond to that last one because I don't want to forget it. There is a measure that Catherine put in that asks about how much they're working at the. What are the exact?
It's an index across different mediated channels, so we can look at specific mediated channels, and then we can look at just an overall frequency index. We also looked at some other communication variables, so not just how much they're talking, but what are they talking about? What kind of things are they sharing? And that is, we're in the process of that. I mean, this is that we've just finished cleaning the data and everything, so that is a forthcoming study. But there's some initial indications when you look at outcome variables related to relationship satisfaction. That's where you're actually seeing a lot of the communication variables coming into play.
But there is also a variable that measures that work-family conflict in terms of communication, how much getting emails infringes on your quality time at home. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Right.
And there were no effects. The communication stuff had no effects. It's more about your actual thoughts about work infringing on your home, or thoughts about home infringing on your work that mattered. That did not.
And I'll jump in here real quickly because Erin, your question's really important. So all my research prior to this has said something slightly different, that again, this is qualitative data, that when work infringes in their evening hours and their weekend hours, so this long hours or having to be in the office regularly or getting called in regularly is really problematic and increases work-family conflict. Again, this is with qualitative data, not with the numbers. And so I think this is going to be one of these things that, again, with a larger sample size, with more of the qualitative data, we'll be able to unpack that a little bit. And I can respond quickly to the middle question that you asked about the
Guilt, right?
the guilt across the partners. I haven't done research on that, but you're absolutely right. A lot of the research, particularly mothers. Wow. All right, I will slide this way. Oh, it was you. I was like, what? Particularly mothers, right, have guilt when they stay, when they're, if their work impacts it, or they're not able to do the things that they would like to do, or that they're expected to do, right? These societal expectations for what intensive mothering is. And I forget what the other one was. The other was on class.
Well, what we did, we controlled for occupation. So we had professional, managerial, service, and clerical.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't change the findings. That's one of the controls. And in regards to the whole work-family conflict in terms of emails and stuff, there are effects obviously on distress, but there doesn't seem to be a difference between these four groups and how it impacts them, right? And that's what we're looking at here, the difference between these four groups.
Jenny?
Just a quick question, did you ask people if they live with a same-sex partner, or so how many in your sample?
Very small. We had like 2 people. Very
Two
small.
that were same-sex, I think.
So there's
Yeah.
no insight in
No,
this is
no.
mostly for heterosexually
Mostly, yeah, that's
living
what the
people.
sample got
Okay.
at, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
yeah.
just wondering because I know you had a lot of factors and you couldn't fit it all.
We did, yeah, no, they didn't. There was no, I think.
It was in the front row, somebody else
Yes.
had, yeah.
Yes, I was just curious how you recruited participants.
Oh, so Qualtrics did it. So we worked with them
They sent out.
we gave them the parameters of what we wanted to include. And so on the slide, let's see if we can back it up. On the measures slide,
You have to go back.
I have to go one more, I think.
Right here.
Right, so we sampled on geographic separation and time together,
Okay.
and tried to get as equal as we could for the groups. And so I think, originally some 3,000 people initiated the study, but we had mechanisms put in place at the beginning of the study that would kick them out if they weren't in the partnerships or if they weren't dual income, whatever that dual income meant. And then as, if they didn't meet certain criteria, and then they sent us the data.
Okay.
And as you can see, the long distance, we had a very hard time getting
Right.
that number up.
Yeah.
Right, and so some of it, we would like a larger sample. It requires larger funding. Is what it totally gets down to, right? So we had the funding that would get us the sample to at least be able to do a pilot study, which is really what this was. And so now we've been trying to send out external grant money to get larger money, because if we can get more money to be able to recruit a larger sample, then that would help us figure this out.
In your sampling to date, were you including people of different ethnic or racial backgrounds
Yes.
as well?
Well, we just asked what their ethnicity, and the majority are white. We had white, then black and Hispanic, and any other group was very tiny. Like, we couldn't really look at race differences besides white and other.
All right, and the second part of that question, were you including people of various incomes rather than just upper middle class?
Yeah, we didn't
didn't select on
screen on
income.
income, we didn't screen on income, so it's what we ended up getting. And so, what we have to do now is with Shirin imputing the data for the missing, for the income, is really look at how many people are in these potentially different categories. What we have now is we've cleaned up the occupational data, and so we rank them into those 4 groupings of clerical, professional, managerial, and which one am I missing, Shirin?
Manager, professional.
Yes.
But the pre-imputed data, it does look like the income overall is high.
It's higher.
I mean, I would think the people with the higher income are more likely to sit in front of a computer to answer these surveys anyways. They have the time perhaps, right? So that's, I think, something we're seeing.
And even I know we're running out of time, even the quote that I gave, her income is just slightly over 30,000. Her spouse's income is in the 40s, so their combined income together still puts them above the median household average of income in the US. So it's still $70,000 to $80,000, even though separately, obviously, their incomes are below the household median.
Wow, I didn't have to show them the book. That's good. Our second presentation is by Jessica Robbins, who's the assistant professor at the Wayne State University Institute of Gerontology and also in the Department of Anthropology, and Tam Perry, who is an assistant professor in the Wayne State University School of Social Work. This is an interdisciplinary team combining both social work and anthropology. The title of their presentation is Care and Abandonment in Neoliberal Times, Older Adult Experiences and Understandings of the Flint Water Crisis. Professors.
We want to start by thanking the Humanities Center, Commuter, for support of our project in Flint, Michigan on the experiences of older adults during the ongoing water crisis, a timely project on older adults who may be vulnerable and are often understudied in humanitarian crises. Through the financial support, we've been able to collect data in multiple field sites to gain differing perspectives on how older adults have fared during these recent events. It allowed us to have one research team member dedicated to the study of older adults in congregate housing, where seniors live together, and other research team members dedicated to the study of community-dwelling older adults living in houses or apartments, in order to draw nuanced insights about the importance of types of residences as older adults navigate these changes in their domestic and municipal infrastructure. We want to thank our entire research team, Kimberly Seibel, Colleen Lynn, and Maxwell Smith, for their efforts on the study, and the Humanities Center for making it possible. First, we'd like to explain how we see our project relating to today's theme, revolution. The Flint water crisis seems to mark a dramatic change in how government relates to its citizenry. Rather than being accountable directly to its citizens through the process of emergency management, the city became accountable for only its financial debts. Even as various government agencies state that the crisis has been resolved, our ongoing ethnographic research shows that many Flint residents continue to believe that their water is unsafe and attribute the water crisis to a host of bodily, mental, and social problems to the water crisis. The water crisis is therefore not only a material fact related to the water itself, but also a crisis of responsibility and morality. The devolution of the democratic ideal raises the questions of whether transformation, change, or revolution may follow this moment. We ask, what forms of life emerge after such a crisis or collapse? And will the previous order be reestablished, or will there be enduring shifts in relations? As perhaps the ultimate failure of neoliberal politics, the Flint water crisis may create possibilities for new forms of action, sociality, and life. In such uncertain and fragile times, other scholars like Kim Fortune or Anna Singh suggest that ethnography is particularly well suited to documenting, participating in, and asking questions about the ruins of capitalism and the afterlife of industrialism. Our ethnographic work on older adult experiences and understandings of the Flint water crisis thus provides a crucial documentation and analysis of a transformational and perhaps revolutionary moment in the lives of Flint residents and broader politics. In the contemporary political moment in which neoliberal policies are radically transforming certain urban landscapes, it is essential to understand these policies' effects on forms of care and abandonment among older adults. Our project has two specific aims: to identify and characterize the perceived individual, social, and political effects, including harms, of the Flint water crisis on older adults, both in the short term and the long term. This includes investigations into the access of resources, caregiving and kin relationships, and comorbidities commonly experienced in older adults. And we also want to identify how the Flint water crisis may shape how older adults navigate everyday activities and larger life decisions. For instance, do people plan to move out of the area? If they could, what happens if they can't? And also, how older adults imagine a future for themselves and their families. We continue to collect data about the older adults' personal moments. So people share with us about how they actually heat water bottles on their, they pour water bottles into pots, heat water on their stove, and then use the water in the pots to bathe. Or they're using baby wipes instead of showering. As well as discuss with us issues of structure, such as who is to blame and how this compares to other environmental disasters. So we continue to ask, for the purposes of this paper, what does care mean in this context, and what does abandonment mean in this context? We have been trying to understand how care and how it is conceptualized by older Flint residents. First, we are trying to understand how older adults conceptualize self-care, what they need to do, what they should be doing, how they view these activities, and kinship care. So, for example, Karen, a 56-year-old African-American female, told us, quote, "I just wonder how this water thing is going to affect my health, my grandkids' health, my children. Like I said, my daughter with the 4 kids moved to another state. But I got one daughter that still lives here who's pregnant again. So I worry about that. She is pregnant again. The last 3 children, I'm counting the unborn one too, were all born during this crisis. And one of them, like I said, he's a mentally challenged or a special needs child. And I do have that, and it's hurtful because I had a special needs child, and when you have a special needs child, you're always wondering if you did something wrong to cause this. I'm wondering if the water affected him and how he's going to be in the future." These older adults, often in grandparenting roles, are watchful of their children and grandchildren. She goes on to say about being a grandmother, "It made me extra, well, I'm protective anyway, but it makes me more protective of what we consume, what we put in our bodies." We also had the opportunity to speak to caregivers. For example, Ruben, a 56-year-old Hispanic male, is the caregiver for Harriet, an 86-year-old white female living in congregate living. Ruben explained, "Flint Township is where they are using the Detroit water or Port Huron River. I can't use the water on our clothes because we use that stuff all day. We keep using the Flint water on our clothes, and I kept wondering why our bodies would be itching. And that's because the lead is in our clothes. So I just go outside of Flint to wash our clothes. Harriet's clothes, my clothes, and that's how I've been doing for the past 2 years. Probably sometimes, it takes an hour and a half extra. So I do that once a week when I could be doing something else, like cleaning my home. But that's what I do because I want her body, meaning Harriet's, not to itch, and myself as well." Ruben is clearly worried about Harriet's physical well-being, but also indicated that he's created a solution to this challenge as a way to provide care, despite the additional effort, distance, and time.
So although the catastrophic aspect of this crisis itself is new, it is also possible to view the Flint water crisis as the latest event in a long history of structural violence in which vulnerable populations have been disproportionately harmed by social change. The oldest generations of Flint residents are particularly well suited to provide insight on the extended temporal nature of such harms. The next example also highlights community members' feelings of abandonment and how it is often intertwined with assessing blame and responsibility for the crisis on those whose duty it was to care or make decisions for a community's well-being. June, a 63-year-old African-American woman said, quote, "The mayor, you know, he stuck around until he was sure in there. He wasn't gonna get fired or nothing. You done killed a city of people, you done genocide them, and you're still walking around making decisions about our life? My great, great, great people had to go through it. Grandmothers, grandfathers, and now I have to go through it. My grandkids, they see it, and now even my grandkids have to go through it. Enough is enough of them doing us any kind of way. But you just wait, God has something for them, honey." Other interviewees offered suggestions for ameliorating some of the challenges resulting from the water crisis. One woman, Jackie, told us, quote, "They'd buy us out and have us move elsewhere, give us a fair price and let us go free." Her partner, Bill, explained, quote, "It seems like it couldn't be done, but, you know, look at other things in the world. Look at what happened in Russia with a couple of bombs going off, and major crises, even the one right now that's going on in Japan, where the tsunami wiped out their nuclear plant. It's just polluted everything. They've moved towns, miles of them." So we just have a few thoughts then in conclusion. So the lived experiences and representations of the water crisis present opportunities to contribute to both anthropology and social work. We'll briefly discuss contributions to both fields. First, we suggest that our study enhances understandings of care and morality, as it will help to explain the generational dynamics of practices and forms of care. Understanding this temporal dimension will help to work against some universalizing assumptions about the moral nature of care that can lurk within some anthropological discussions. When understood as a practice that defines our humanity, or as a response to structural violence, care seems to be an unquestioned good. Yet practices of care can also be violent and enmeshed within coercive regimes of gendered, racialized forms of labor and politics. By focusing on practices and forms of care across domains, bodily, social, political, our ethnographic data contribute to burgeoning anthropological discussions on the complex and seemingly contradictory nature of what we call care. Second, our project contributes to understandings of kinship and political economy, spheres that are often thought to be separate in scholarly analysis. We have documented how the water crisis is reshaping daily life in ways both mundane, like the techniques of cooking and bathing that we've talked about, reorganizing schedules to accommodate water pickups for deliveries for pickup sites that only have certain opening hours, as well as profound transformations, such as reconfiguring notions of trust and responsibility, and the dismantling of personhood and citizenship. So drawing on the so-called new kinship studies in anthropology, in our analysis, we're viewing these transformations of daily life and social relations as transformations in practices and ideals of relatedness and how people come to be related to each other and what is expected of those relations. So although anthropologists tend to treat kinship and political economy as separate realms of life, recent scholarship has demonstrated that this distinction is actually a result of modernist domaining practices rather than an actual separation existing in the world. And so by studying how these practices and ideals are transforming amidst this ongoing crisis of neoliberal politics and humanitarian aid, this research integrates studies of kinship with contemporary anthropological theories of the welfare state and humanitarian aid. We're also working on analyzing this data in the context and within the frameworks of thinking about embodied memory and materiality in post-industrial environments. For the oldest generations in Flint, the current water crisis, or potentially multiple water crises, depending on how you think about it, are the latest in a lifetime of lived experiences of inequality, racism, and discrimination. Our research asks how contemporary harms resonate with histories of structural violence, yet can also escape or exceed the dominant narratives. So understanding the contemporary experiences of water issues among older adults through the lens of embodied memory can contribute then to anthropological theories of how memory works across diverse scales, bodily, social, and political. So taken together, understanding the embodied and material dimensions of memory evident in the water crisis will contribute to anthropological knowledge on how systems of racial inequality operate in the post-industrial urban environment. Our research also shows promise to contribute to social work research at both a practice and policy level. We are identifying the various micro, meso, and macro level ways that practitioners can and should be involved in similar contexts. These include understanding the challenges and barriers to procuring water, information flows about how to install and replace filters, which our research shows is not always evident to residents, as well as mental health needs like anxiety and trust and hoarding behaviors. In addition, we must consider appropriate rapid responses across the lifespan, including assessment of vulnerability, such as who requires door-to-door delivery of supplies or monitoring, noting that ageism may also be present in these decision-making processes. Finally, we assert that examining the experiences of older adults can give us understanding into key concepts that both anthropologists and social work scholars explore, such as the lived experiences of structural racism and why older adults exhibit and explicitly discuss challenges and strengths that demonstrate a differential resilience. Thanks, and we welcome your questions.
We have about 10 minutes for questions if you have any.
Can you talk a little bit about your methodology?
Yeah.
Oh, me? Okay, so this is our research design. Sorry. So we started our project trying to find 25 older adults in Flint. And actually, there's a large Wayne State team involving Sean McElmurray and Paul Kilgore that actually was going door to door doing some water sampling. So they handed out our flyer saying, are you an older adult interested in participating in a sort of a qualitative study? So we got a lot of people from that, but sometimes we found people at community meetings. We went to a lot of community meetings as part of our participant observation. So in our methodology, we are certainly using participant observation of community meetings as well as events involving seniors. So what kind of community events, including like lead testing, including health information fairs, and including like free food, grocery delivery, not delivery, but free grocery bags are happening. And so we've gone around to those. But we're also doing a photo elicitation component too. So we've asked people to take photos of what aging and the water crisis means to them. We're doing a photo exhibit on Monday in Flint because we've been really trying to get our research out within the community also. So that's been interesting. And then we do a follow-up, we print the photos and then do a follow-up interview with them about sort of what they were thinking when they took the photos. And we've been doing overall 3 visits about 6 months apart, and where possible meeting people, others in people's kin networks as a way to sort of understand how kinship networks are understanding the water crisis as a whole, kinship network. We also were able to get access to a congregate living situation in Flint, and so we've also been doing it. And so these people all live together. So one of the photos I showed you of 2 people looking at a water filter is that one neighbor in this congregate living was installing a replacement water filter for another. So we've seen a lot of sort of interesting group dynamics, people living together, processing this experience. And the other thing we did was we added interviewing staff. And one of the things about staff who work in congregate living is that they're often viewed in other contexts as low-wage workers. So job burnout, the transitory nature of this job. So we wanted to see how, if we talk to staff, how if your day job is to care for people, and then you also have to go home and care for your family in this water crisis, how are you actually, it's interesting kind of building on your, how are you like a caregiver at work and a caregiver at home in different ways? Some people find respite at work because it's a little different than if you have 3 young kids and you can't let them use the water to brush their teeth. And so coming to work, it's a different thing. But other people, they kind of have to, like on their way home, then go to the water station and pick up water for them. So it's interesting how, so we've had fascinating interviews with staff. So that's our recruitment and sample.
2 questions. One is the ecological impact plants and animals, so if you grew vegetables there, would you also get lead? And second, we are hearing that plastic bottles are filled with pieces of plastic. So is this the second round of impact on these people who are relying on plastic-filled water bottles?
Yes, so those are definitely questions that are on the minds of Flint residents. People report to us and have demonstrated to us that they only give bottled water to their pets, and that they water their plants with bottled water. And that they can, indoor plants, and, the indoor plants, and that they, you can see the difference between plants that are watered with bottled water and plants that are watered with tap water. That's what's reported to us as anthropologists, social workers, gerontologists. We're not actually,
So what if
that
you
kind
eat-
of scientist
yeah,
to evaluate
yeah. What if you
that
grew a
effect
garden
itself.
and ate the vegetables from it?
Yeah,
What's
Right.
gonna happen down that line?
And I think
Right.
that goes beyond the scope of our research, but I would say these worries and anxieties, and we're actually developing sort of really trying to understand how we're gonna to understand people living with uncertainty. So I think in a lot of ways, they're, especially in the congregate living site, they're exposed to lots of discourse / rumors / processing about what they should be doing. And I would even say before, like, should I grow vegetables this summer? People were really very much misunderstanding whether they should use their taps, whether they should boil water. Some people thought boiling water would alleviate the lead, but actually it increases the lead. So it was interesting. And then, of course, Legionella, which is another thing that the Wayne State team is looking at, also sort of are there things other than lead in my water that I should be worried about as an older adult? So I would say, while gardening and sort of that kind of thing, I think other pressing water issues have come up. But I would say people express, and including, they're very worried about all the water bottles that sit in the sun at the they're called pods, point of distribution sites. And, they're out in the sun for a long time. So people, they're on their, I think, starting 4th year of the water crisis. So people using this for everything they do, bottled waters, and people certainly express concern about the plastic.
People also express concern and anxiety about different brands of water, different brands of bottled water, and so one of our research participants actually tests the bottled water because she doesn't trust she said she tests one bottle in every case because she's not sure that what she's getting is safe there either. So the level of distrust and the extent of it is really quite pervasive.
And we
Can
also
you
asked,
distill water to get lead out of it? Did they build a big distillery up there and distill all their water, steam it through and then the particles leave? I don't know the
I think the
science.
pipes in the actual homes got very damaged. So there's a lot of question on they're trying in the next 3 or 4 years to replace 6,000 pipes, as I understand it. But I think now, because of the corrosion problem, it's that the pipes have to be replaced.
Yeah, but I mean distill by boiling into steam and then
What?
collecting the water.
Oh, I
does
see.
that
Oh,
with
like that.
lead.
Not
So
like
they
a
could build a
incinerator.
great distillery up there and have
Oh, I see.
water
I
that
see.
doesn't
But
come out of
but
a
you
plastic.
would
my
eliminate a
understanding.
lot of good stuff there too, right? You would have only distilled water. You would eliminate the lead
Oh, I
and all of the
understand.
mineral
I-
salts,
I
and then you would
understand.
need to re-add them in terms
Yeah.
of cost.
And again, we are social scientists, so it's a little beyond the scope of what we think about. But I will say, I have not heard that. I actually haven't heard anyone using that technique. And we ask detailed questions about how people are preparing vegetables, meat, etc. We also ask very clearly, what are you using tap water for? Like, are you using tap water to wash your dishes? Are you bathing in it? Some people are not bathing in it, some people are. Some people say you have to bathe. So I guess that's what we're discussing. And then the other thing about some older adults are really switching to baby wipes, and that was very interesting to us, that they've just given up bathing with water. Yes?
I actually have 2 questions. One, you said that people were skeptical about what types of water were safe to use. Do you happen to know off the top of your head what types are and what types aren't, what is trusted and what isn't? And number two, you mentioned that the lady that you were talking about, she would test a bottle in every case. What test was she running that she could tell if the water was safe or
That's a
wasn't?
good question.
So I don't think we've had any consensus that X brand is good and Y brand is bad. It's more that people are generally suspicious. And as to which test she was using, there's a small, like the size of a pen, kind of plastic device that you can sample the water and it will tell you if there's lead in it.
Oh, wow.
But we were also baffled by it too.
She took it out and said, here's.
Yeah, so
Wow.
we were asking questions like, where did you get this?
Yeah.
Have you always, and it's also interesting because some people, because the world has also transitioned to bottled water, some people have been using bottled water to drink before the crisis, and then now they're excited that it's free. So that's been an interesting also twist on that, yeah.
Right. I mean, that's one thing about the nature of ethnographic work is that when you get into any kind of new field site, all of a sudden you have to get a working vernacular knowledge of whatever the thing is you're studying, not just the anthropological questions about care and kinship and that we're interested in aging, but also what is this water? What does it mean to have lead and other kinds of contaminants? So we've all gotten a little bit more up to speed than we were coming into this project.
And also then there's the filters. If you have a filter on your faucet, so we have found people whose faucets don't fit filters. So I think it's interesting to examine who's responsible in that case. Like a landlord is responsible for changing out a filter, or is it a resident, a tenant, etc. We have to stop, but we're happy to talk at lunch.
Yeah.
All right.